looks like our participants are leveling off a little bit. So we can go ahead and get started with the introductory side of this. Welcome everyone to the September edition of Water Data Forum. Water Data Forum is a monthly series presented throughout the course of this year by Cleveland Water Alliance, the Midwest Big Data Innovation Hub, and the Water Environment Federation. I'm Max Herzog, a program manager with Cleveland Water Alliance, and I'll be facilitating today's discussion. This session is going to be focused on an interesting intersection of issues around community empowerment, resident engagement, and watershed management. And we've chosen to call this Open Watersheds, Innovations in Community Water Data. We're going to engage with a whole host of interesting topics, including both the technology side of open and also the collaboration and partnership building side of that. And thinking about how those tools and frameworks can really apply to community level watershed and water resource management. Before we dive into today's conversation though, I want to remind folks to be submitting questions throughout the course of this session. We should be on for about an hour here today and have 10 or 15 minutes or so for Q&A at the end. So really encourage you to submit questions throughout the conversation as they come to your mind using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you submit your questions earlier, our panelists may be able to respond via text as other folks are speaking. So definitely get those in as they pop into your brain. With that, it's my great pleasure to introduce briefly our panelists here today. With us, zooming in, are you in Colorado today, Barb, or are you elsewhere? Zooming in from Colorado, Barb Horn with Barb Horn LLC. We have joining us from Ann Arbor, Michigan, Brandon Wong, Executive Director with Wi-Fi. And then coming in both from Northeast Ohio, Cleveland area, we've got Mark App, the founder and project manager of Great Lakes Data Watershed, and Whitney Long Jones, the founder and executive director of Organic Connects. I think as we start to hear a little bit from our panelists, you'll see that they're each engaging with these concepts of open watersheds and community engagement through different frameworks and with different approaches, but with a lot of the same underlying mission. And with that, I think we can dive into some more of this conversation. And by way of introducing you and introducing your work, I'd like to ask our panelists today to answer this question. What do open watersheds mean to you? You can talk about an open watershed in terms of the technology, the organizational ecosystem, the community, but what does it mean to you and to your work? And to start to kick this one off, I'll bump this over to Brandon to ask him what open watersheds mean to him.
Cool. Thanks, Max. Thumbs up. You can hear me okay? Yeah, sweet. All righty, cool. Thanks for having me here. I'm excited to be here. So I'm Brandon, as Max said, and yeah, so open watersheds, what that means. Ultimately, I think I'm here for the technological side of things, so I'll stick to that first. A little bit more about me. My dad was a math teacher, so I grew up having to show my work. And you can only imagine how excited I was to see Chipotle open up and see them making the burrito in front of me. But when it comes to technology, I think there's a responsibility to see what's going on underneath the hood. And that's really where my experience comes in, is open source technologies when it comes related to watershed monitoring. Where does the data come from? What really creates these ones and zeros, and building that whole entire chain from the physical device all the way up until when it goes into this cloud. So I think just using that to now take a minute to provide some transparency into the technology, help enable these broader conversations and allow people to speak openly about what they know about the watershed and use this data to help inform that. So
that's great, Brendan. Thinking about open in terms of the actual design and pieces and makeup of individual technologies used to monitor watersheds. Next up, maybe Mark, we can have you speak to this. What do open watersheds mean for you and your work?
Well, to me, open watersheds the most important thing is universal accessibility. Now that's more, I would call that open standards more than open source. And giving a little bit of my background, I was an analytical chemist early in my career, taught chemistry in high school, ran an analytical water lab, and also wrote laboratory automation software. And in addition to that, after that, most of my career I spent in enterprise computing, where we built high performance systems, enterprise systems, and infrastructure systems. So, you know, I came into this idea of open watersheds through the Erie hack in 2019. Saw Max at a meetup and got enlisted. And I really got excited because I could tie my knowledge of computer architecture and high technology there, and I worked for 2 Silicon Valley companies, and tie that into a thing that I think could make open watersheds. So when I'm talking about what we're working on, I'm currently working on the Great Lakes Data Watershed, which was evolved out of the 2019 Erie hack. And it's all about open watersheds from my interpretation of what an open watershed is. And what that is it's universal accessibility. And when you talk about openness, it's open standards. So it means that if I put data out there, that somebody can know how to go get it. But more than open standards, it's important to be open and simple and optimal standards. So what I'm suggesting is the current open standards in research data exchange probably aren't adequate because they're way too complicated. So we put together a set of what we consider a good draft of open standards for exchanging data very quickly and efficiently, and saying that anybody can sit there and in almost ridiculously easily get data from many sources.
Absolutely. So moving up maybe that chain of data collection to decision making, moving from those core data collection technologies to the management side of things, and looking past, you know, how data sets are managed and towards how they're integrated and brought together to be able to be used for greater impact.
And exactly, and that's the problem with current system designs, is that you're thinking very much in terms of my little siloed system. And we decide how we're going to present the data and what we're going to do with it. We don't make the data available to everybody, so everybody can contribute. So that's why I emphasize open, simple standards for exchanging data.
Great, thanks so much, Mark. So, you know, Mark and Brandon really capturing a couple of different aspects of the technical side of what an open watershed can mean. I want to call Whitney into the conversation here to speak a little more to what open watersheds mean for your work.
Absolutely. And thank you, Max. I do have to say that Brandon and Mark are really on point from the technical side of things. I heard Brandon mention transparency, and we heard Mark mention accessibility, and that's really what it boils down to. So one, putting things in terms that someone who is unfamiliar with the field can understand. You know, sometimes language, terminology, cultural differences can definitely present barriers to understanding how important watersheds are, and even what watershed means. You know, how do they impact our daily lives? So that education is really important, that effort for organizations to become more involved with community members and stakeholders, and even taking it as far as offering training and job opportunities. So full circle, you know, making that whole connection. If the community is going to be involved and appreciate what a watershed is, if we're talking open, why not make it a more holistic approach?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's really, really well made points there, Whitney. And maybe now, Barb, you can expand a little more on, you know, what it means to empower communities in the case of your work.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Really great points. And let me know if you can't hear me, Max. So I've experienced, you know, I'm answering this from a question or a perspective of the relationship between residents and institutions. And I've experienced that successful relationship firsthand in Colorado, also regionally and internationally. For example, the program that I started 30 some years ago still generates today high quality data for the Clean Water Act in Colorado. And it was, some of you might have remembered when the Gold King spill happened, and you saw pictures of a river that looked like Harry Potter butterbeer. That was in my backyard. And the EPA used this citizen science volunteer data to determine when that river had returned back to its pre-spill conditions. Why was that? Well, it was because we aligned with a lot of the open data standards that Mark, and the technology was transparent that Brandon was talking about. But I'd like to bring this concept to this open watershed conversation about building these relationships between the citizens and the community, residents, and institutions that manage our resources. And that is thinking about using technology as part of a solution to shift the culture that we're in and how we manage. And it's really a power shift. If you want to think of the power now as kind of vertical, and what we're working on using technology is to make the power more horizontal. So it's not just about exchanging data, it's who has the information, who gets to make the decisions, and how can open watersheds level that playing field in a trustworthy, predictable way so that citizens are actually taking more ownership of their resource in a powerful way, and agencies are allowing that and feeding that with resources and not threatened by it. And then citizens are also upping their game and creating, being more relevant and getting rid of their biases about what agencies can and can't do, and really changing that landscape. So I know I kind of loaded that with a lot, but there you have it.
No, that's great. And I think, you know, we're seeing a lot of different strands come out from each of what y'all are saying, but strands that start to connect and weave together. You know, what I'm hearing is that we can talk about when we talk about open watersheds, we're generally talking about how can we get, you know, community members engaged in the management of their resources, but there are technology components to that. There are organizational components to that, accessibility components. All of these different factors really fold together to help us understand what truly open watersheds would mean for our communities. And I'm wondering if we can move the conversation now into starting to define a little better, you know, how these different tools can really benefit or empower communities. You know, for example, thinking here in Northeast Ohio, where Cleveland Water Alliance is based, or up in Southeast Michigan, where Hi-Fi is based, or where Hi-Fi is based, or even out in Colorado, Barb, where you're based. I'm wondering if folks could speak a little to how can these concepts of open watersheds best support or empower communities? What is the value proposition for people? And maybe I'll invite Brandon to speak to that one first, from your experience with Hi-Fi.
Cool. All right. Well, I think everyone said some really great things, and I latched onto a lot of what Barb had said too, particularly like I wrote down relationships and like circled it 5-10 times. So like for us, and being like a small company and a tech startup, and dipping our feet into like being a company for once, like out of the research sphere, which is where, you know, I'm home at. Building these relationships, really trying to understand where people are coming from, was really where we spent a lot of our legwork. And I think it's been really beneficial to help us understand where, very beneficial just to understand where are people coming from, what's really valuable to them. And like, there's a lot of work already being done, at least in Southeast Michigan, and we learned in Northeast Ohio too, with watershed management and protection. And so just for some of the examples, like we were working with the Sugar River watershed partners, who like use this information for stream restoration and education, and that's kind of what their sphere is. And whereas like with Cleveland Metro Parks, that's also for like recreational and reaching out to the community that way. And whereas if it's more from a utility side of things, just making sure that the waterways are operating properly, that things are draining and that nothing is flooding. If it is, that they have the information on hand to react quickly. And there's even in Michigan and New York, like we're working with wildlife biologists who are protecting and enhancing wetlands to provide like a better environment. So there's a lot of different ways that people cut and slice like what water means to them. And you know, it's just something that we're just hoping to provide some additional on the ground information to enable them to make these decisions.
Absolutely, yeah. So looking at all these different decision-making points that watershed data can be plugged into, and how can that, inform all these different practices like restoration and stormwater management. Um, that's really powerful. Barb, would you like to speak to that, expand on it a little more, maybe from the perspective of community organizations and facilitating these partnerships?
Sure. I jotted down, I wanted your listeners to have maybe 3 tangible things, even if they're high level. And so I might sound like a broken record, but thank you, Brandon, because one of mine was build relationships. Too often technology comes in with its excitement and it's a bell and whistle, and groups want to tack on and they don't have a context for it because no one has spent that time helping them build the context on how to use it. So it just becomes a strategy that actually has a short-term gain, but a not long sustainability, even if it could have, because it didn't have that context. It's just a shiny bell and whistle, and these groups don't have the right capacity to either use it well or use it at all. The second thing is that this concept of open watersheds, whether it's technology, whatever piece you bite off of it, it needs to move. The filter I put it through all the time is ask yourself, how is it serving holism? How is it serving, and what do I mean by holism? How is what I'm about to do serving us actually, again, kind of moving to this structure where we're all in it together. It's not the community versus the agency, or the agency. It's not the company industry against the community. It's like, how can this serve holism? How can this technology serve us coming together in a whole innovative way? Because the culture of accountability doesn't actually facilitate holism. It doesn't facilitate collaboration and innovation. And agencies are in a culture of accountability where they just have to fulfill their mission, their grant, and that really stifles innovation. And the third thing I'll close with is thinking more about creatively the type of data. We often get stuck in physical, chemical, or biological data. We do need to use the data that exists better. And that's where technology can be huge. It's because often groups, agencies are guilty of this too. We need this data, we'll go get it. We won't even check and see what's there because it's too hard to get. But community scientists and volunteers, actually the kind of data that could be collected to actually open and change this playing field could really make a difference. And I could tell stories about that to give examples, but I'm talking about data maybe in other sectors, in health and economy. And I know Whitney knows a lot about this, like what really other stories that happened in Detroit beyond the lead story. There was data that was collected about bills and invoices and demographics like that changed the water supply availability for those people. It's a completely different kind of data, and we need to think out of the box on that. So with that, those are my 3 tips.
Really, really helpful, helping us think, past the connection of individual, or the collection of individual data streams and how those are leveraged, and thinking more holistically how we can build sort of an ecosystem of folks that are sharing information and trusting information that they're sharing with one another. I think that's really helpful. Thinking about building these sorts of relationships and implementing these sorts of technologies, obviously there are barriers facing those of us interested in enabling these kinds of community-oriented watershed solutions. And so I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about some of the barriers that we're facing in this area, and how we're working to try and address them. And with that, maybe Mark, we can go to you really quickly to talk about some of the more technical barriers.
Okay, and I think I'm going to take it a little beyond the technical barriers, because the question comes up. We have technical barriers, which is how we make the data accessible, and we're very bad at making it accessible. Most of the systems provide a way to get it, but it takes a lot of work to get it, and they're not the same. So to me, open and simple standards is the technological approach, and that's what we're doing at GLDW. Essentially, we're taking data from different sources and putting it in one pot where you can access it the same way, very simply. But I'd like to look even further as to why we have those barriers, and I think it's a lack of the way we have vision, our vision of things. So in one case, our systems become complex and over, take a long time and stuff, and that's really a vision thing. We think that these systems have to be very expensive, complex, and take a long time to build, and predictably they do. And they're isolated systems, and we think of them in a stovepipe. We don't think that this has got to be a resource for the whole community. And so that stovepipe thinking and the complex thinking is one thing that causes the technology to be bad and fail. And I'm not saying it's all been bad and failed, but it ends up with, you believe it's going to be complex and take a long time. You end up taking a long time and not meeting all your requirements. You have that prejudgment that that's going to happen. And that's where I think we fall down in a lot of systems, and they don't include open standards because of that lack of vision, that stovepipe vision. The other limitation, I think, in our vision is to do with what we talk about when we talk about citizens and scientists and how we look at roles. You know, when we think of a citizen scientist, we generally think of someone collecting data as kind of a lab technician, writing it down or entering in a computer, being the hands on the ground. You know, we think that someone doing science, that's how someone who's a volunteer does science. And I'd like you to imagine different types of citizen volunteers that might participate. Consider a retired NASA engineer. Consider a very talented, maybe motivated Cleveland high school student. Consider a 30-ish computer professional who's an expert in pattern recognition. Now, if we gave them a playing field where they could all play, and we make it based on open standards, and it's easy to get the data, I could see any one of them making some very insightful and important discoveries about the relationship of the data in our system. So I really believe breaking down barriers in how we let roles play on these systems and how we design them, and the vision that drives that, is the most important thing. And again, the Great Lakes Data Watershed, we're focusing on that goal.
Thanks, Mark. That's really helpful in helping us kind of elucidate some of these barriers that we're facing and how we can start to, you know, move past them. I'm wondering, Whitney, if you would like to chime in on this question and speak to more of some of the broader social and economic challenges facing these kinds of solutions.
Absolutely. So one, I want to agree with Barb. You mentioned the Clean Water Act in Colorado in the 1960s. Cleveland can absolutely relate to that. We had the whole Cuyahoga River burning in the 1960s as well, and which, you know, brought on also the Clean Water Act in the area. So Mark, I love the citizen volunteers. That is absolutely important. And I think if we can take it back a little bit further, even still sticking to the 1960s, even before that, we had issues like redlining, you know, the Jim Crow era, going back even further. So unfortunately, you had people of color that were automatically pushed to parts of the neighborhood, parts of the cities that experienced huge amounts of disinvestment. So now you're seeing some of that even still continuing when we're talking about cities who are experiencing dirty, unclean drinking water, you know, still happening today, which is crazy. So going back to the decision making, the exposure and opportunities to be a part of that process is really, really important. So some of the socioeconomic barriers that exist today are absolutely tied to this country's history. So even though we want to start from here and say, let's make sure we're making access, let's make sure we are encouraging folks to become more involved and giving them opportunities to become involved, it really has to start with that policy change. You know, what are we doing for the communities who are still suffering today? There are people who are struggling to meet their basic, find ways to get their basic needs met. If someone's hungry, if, you know, someone's working multiple jobs, it's not that the environment or their community isn't important to them. It's just that they have other priorities. When you're living day to day, all you're thinking of doing is surviving. So how can we provide more resources by addressing what has happened in this country's history? It's harsh and it's real. So I think that policy change, organizations, institutions have to be honest about that. And Barb, to your point, I think that the organizations are also victim to how things have been set up, because if you're striving to meet deliverables within your organizations because of the grants or because of the federal funding, those can even present the same barriers. You know, they perpetuate the way the system exists. So how can we really start to look at the picture as a whole to begin making that change? Some community, and let me talk a little bit about community. So I know we keep saying that word, and it doesn't have to be, community doesn't have to be just a geographic region. Community can mean a group of people that you are attached to, you have a common interest that you communicate with on a regular basis, and geographically that can exist anywhere. So it's just being clear about what community is. And, you know, it could be a place, it could be a group of people, it can be a neighborhood, it can be geographic. So just being open-minded about that. But when we're talking about engaging the communities and demographics of folks who are disconnected from this entire process, maybe there is a lack of education, maybe there is, again, struggling to meet your basic needs, so there are other survival priorities. And I think that being realistic about that, it's way bigger than what you and I or anyone on this panel can handle in the moment, but it is starting to create exactly what we're having in this conversation, seats at the table for folks to say, hey, this is happening where I live and I want to have a say in it. How can I know more about this? How can I understand your process? And how can I be a part of it? So a couple of those things, social constructs, the history of the country, language barriers / terminology are just a few of the barriers that I can think of right off the top of my head.
Yeah, so we definitely have our work cut out for us, it looks like here. But thank you so much, Whitney, for diving into that. I think, you know, talking about how these conversations dovetail into broader conversations about equity, systemic racism, et cetera, you know, all of these issues that are really at the forefront of national conversations now really do have relevance to environmental issues and the way that we manage our water resources. And I think, you know, we've certainly seen, Barb and I and other folks who are working in the community science world right now, these challenges in terms of just looking at the makeup of folks who are able to participate in volunteer-based watershed management activities. You know, it's deeper inclusion issues than you even see generally in the environmental community, I would even venture to say. And so figuring out how these programs can be accessible, and also, you know, I think relevance is an issue as well. You know, there's a certain kind of person that has the, as you said, kind of like the capacity, I guess, to think about what's going on in my local watershed. How can I participate and contribute to that? You know, maybe it's looking at things more like, you know, how do we evaluate water quality in the home at the tap, where, you know, folks who are most impacted by environmental issues tend to have the most concern. But I think these sorts of conversations are really important. Just to sort of bring things back together a little bit, you know, I think we've had a really interesting conversation between our 4 panelists on these different concepts of what it means to have open watersheds and, you know, connecting our communities to our water resources in a way that's empowering. And I feel like I've heard a couple of themes come out pretty consistently. The first is really about building relationships between, you know, in my mind, Whitney, you started to define community, and it pushed me to think a little bit, how have I been thinking about that? And I feel like in my mind, I'm thinking about community as, you know, next to or compared to like institutions in that way. And we're talking about how do we build relationships between community members, residents, more everyday people who aren't professional in this type of work, and those institutions who have expertise, who have decision-making power. How do we build those kinds of relationships to both increase the credibility of community groups with decision makers and help to bring that technical capacity that the institutions have to bring this to bear for communities? I feel like it's one of the things that I'm hearing.
Can I build on that a little, Max, please?
Please go for it, yeah.
Yeah, so that's big. So when we talk about relationship building, and that's also one of my favorite things to do, it is so important. So I'm glad that everybody has mentioned that. Barb started it, and everyone else has mentioned it quite a few times at that point. When we think about relationship building, it's easy to connect with someone who's similar to you. who thinks like you, who has the same educational background, the same beliefs, same cultural values. But the difficulty comes in when, and even the divisiveness of taking in what we see in the media and those implicit biases, some of them explicit, and we formulate an opinion about what we think, how we think somebody is. And that completely cuts off any opportunity to speak to that individual, get to know them. And once you actually do, you find out there's so much that we have in common, So I would just say, there's a lot of organizations who are taking the initiative and making an effort to do the diversity, equity, and inclusion training, to take cultural sensitivity classes. And that's really important. So I just want to throw that out there. Like, if you're really trying to make an effort, make a change, it has to start with one person. So organizations exist, but organizations are also made up of individual people. And leadership has to be the one to say, this is the culture of our organization. What are some of our hiring practices? What is the way that we're doing engagement, as opposed to just outreach? Two completely different things. One takes it to a whole nother level. So engagement and even organizing, it's bringing in the people that you're surveying, actually working with them, getting feedback from them, finding out what it is that they need, whether they understand the process or not. Listen to what it is that people are saying are issues in their communities, or what they could do more with or benefit from, trying to find the right way to say that. But it's really just being open-minded about how you're connecting with people and being humble about it too, sitting back and listening instead of judging someone, or instead of saying, well, they don't understand because of this for whatever reason. And unfortunately, again, our history has put us in a position where we do label people. And part of it's natural, it's a self-preservation to judge someone when you initially meet them, but it's checking those biases and being more open to how you're connecting with people and starting to build those relationships.
Absolutely. Barb, did you want to respond to that a little bit? I saw you unmute, and Mark as well.
Well, I just want to, sometimes I use the metaphor because we're talking about technology and workflow and data standards and things. And to give that in the context of everything that Whitney so eloquently just explained, I often sometimes think it may not be a perfect metaphor, but is data and technology and all those other tools is like the nucleus of a cell. And we can get really excited about those, but the cell itself has to be vibrant and healthy and integrated and inclusive. And a lot of these programs and technologies, I'm finding their first thing is I collect data. I develop fancy websites and models, and I don't have to do what Whitney just described. And that is a silo, as Mark so well said. So thinking about the cell, and when the cell is healthy, the cell can reproduce, and it reproduces in a whole way that the same cell in your kidney could be the same cell in your lung, could be the same cell across issues that really provide this amazing foundation. And it's really finding that sweet spot with technology it has to be in service of, and along the lines of equity and justice, it might mean, like a good question to ask yourself is, who is making all these standards? Not the data sharing standards, that's a technology, but who decides what's clean? Who decides, and as Whitney said, that is influenced a lot by a lot of shadow history, that we might need to actually shift resources that might look inequitable on the surface. It would take a lot of brave decisions, but technology can help provide the data to justify those decisions and show then progress towards an equitable and inclusive sort of approach to managing our resources for quality of life for all.
Yeah, I really like what you guys are pushing towards here, which, for me feels like, how do we not just build relationships, but get to the point in those relationships where we can define sort of a shared vision. I think, Mark, you were speaking to vision earlier a bit, and thinking about, having folks aligned together behind, these are the ecological or social or economic outcomes we want to see. Barb, earlier you mentioned the idea of pushing past accountability as sort of a core pillar of monitoring and moving towards innovation, I think that's obviously a really big challenge to think about, because accountability is very important. And, starting to think about defining these visions, one can see how it becomes complicated really quickly when you bring together these different stakeholder groups with different issue areas. But it feels like that shared vision is a big component of what y'all are pushing towards here.
And I think there's the part of that you're emphasizing, which I think is really important. But I come back to the idea of our roles in the environmental ecosystem. And I think that saying that certain individuals shouldn't be analyzing the water or shouldn't be trying to draw insights because they're just citizens. We want to put the data out there so that everybody can play different roles in it. And I think that would lead to, many of the goals that you talk about too, if we have more of an openness and the ability of people to play in different roles. And I think one of the reasons that are so hard to get the data is because we don't envision that people might want to go and get it, that aren't going to spend a month trying to get it. At one of the last workshops you had, Max, somebody asked the question, well, how, what do you need to plan for if you're going to use open standards? And they said, well, you need to have somebody that's a data scientist, that's a specialist in environment. And I heard this. That's implying that it has to be difficult and it's not accessible to everybody. So I'm focusing more on the roles, but I think it goes hand in hand with what your concerns would be too.
Yeah, absolutely. It looks like we actually have a question coming in from our audience here, and I think we can start to turn to that as well if other folks want to be sharing questions in the Q&A or in the chat. Lynn Klotz would like to hear more about building relationships with agencies, particularly local and state. I think, Barb, you have a really, specific experience working to sort of justify the credibility of data collected by a community group to the state and, have it be used for regulatory purposes. Do you want to speak a little more to how we can work to build these relationships, particularly with, maybe the state being more interested in, as they should be in sort of transparency and regulatory purposes, and then some of the other actors we might be more interested in pushing the envelope and trying new solutions, that sort of thing. How do you reconcile these different interests?
Yeah, I'll try to give three sort of lines of approach. And one is to look at our community science programs defined broadly, like Whitney did. We need to up the game and up the bar. And to get out of our own culture of accountability, we can't just say our role is to collect the data and we just expect somebody else to use it. And we don't have to build that relationship. We don't have to go ask and search and find out what data is actually needed or think broadly. And the value of community scientists is they don't have those barriers. They can, if they can do enough, get enough access to information, which Mark is saying, it's absolutely unlimited and amazing what people will do. And I think agencies are both threatened by that, excited by that, and have no clue about that all at the same time. So I would say for community scientists, you need to up your game. You need to be relevant. Your role is just not to go out there and educate willy-nilly, and not that you guys are doing that, but not just to collect data for the sake of data. This is a principle for everybody. Data should never, ever be the end, ever. It should always be a means to a result, impact, or outcome. And that's the context that technology can help make happen along. And that then builds relationships. If you've made a difference, now you have something to talk about. So community science groups, you need to up your game on what you think you can do. And you don't always need an agency to make a difference. The first watershed manager is each and every one of us in our own backyard, whatever that backyard is. And then we need to think bigger. We need to think about how we are related to that river, how that river is related to that lake and that whole watershed. So we need to up our game and keep producing data of known quality that is relevant. That isn't always easy, but we need to do that. Agencies need to look at their own biases and change their culture, basically, and get out of that culture of accountability where they can slowly and look at their own biases on how they're actually where they're gathering data, how they're making decisions, and what kind of information what might inform those decisions better. California is a really great state that's taken these layers of redlining and economic and racial justice data, laid it on to their water, where they monitor, how they make decisions, and it's completely shifted how they're now allocating resources to do protection and restoration. So it's possible. And what made that possible was a willingness to check their biases. Every one of their staff has gone through a 3-year program, pretty detailed, that Whitney described, on culture sensitivity, and then technology has allowed that exchange of information to happen. So both sides have a bias. And this is the last thing I'll say to that. Both sides need to work on their bias about the other. And again, sort of break down that vertical horizontal line. And then finally, a train went through my head here. I lost my thought. So if I get it back, I'll give it to you. You guys hear that train?
Feel free to chime in when the train comes back through the station. Yeah, I really thought there's a lot that's really interesting in what you said, Barb, and both about the feasibility of state community organization collaborations, that it can really happen, that work needs to happen on both sides, but also that it's not the end all be all of these sorts of community collaborations. And I know that we've seen the Cleveland Water Lines through our Smart Citizen Science program. There's been a lot of value in just having community science organizations across the Lake Erie region start to talk to each other and figure out how they can work together. And I imagine that this would, extend to other types of, community-based watershed management, that we can collaborate with, our communities can collaborate with themselves, with each other, with other communities around the area, and try to build more of like a regional approach to attacking some of these issues as well, which I think is quite interesting.
I remembered, if it's still okay.
Please go for it.
I use the language of lane filling. Agencies fill their lane well, and citizen science groups can fill their lane well, and we too often look at the other to do everything else for us. It's kind of like looking at your wife or your husband or your partner to fill all your needs. It's not possible. So what you want to look for is this sweet spot where you have this common ground, and often that's in a condition or trend or use assessment. Like, what is the condition of my water? Is the fish safe to eat? Is it safe to swim on that beach? It's often that's a very sweet spot to start, and find the places where you can work together well. So, and then that way you're building on what your lanes are, and you're merging. You're not actually chastising each other for lanes that either one of you don't fill very well or can't fill. You could fill, but it's not your sweet spot. So finding how to leverage the fact that citizens are there and they know, and they can collect data over space and time, and they can do technology. Where would that actually help you as an agency, and sell yourself as that to that, and demonstrate that you can provide. One of the biggest things community scientists can do is provide predictable, consistent data of a known quality for a specific data use or purpose, not everything. And I think also just understanding that both sides have a limit in their capacity. We often get divisive with each other, as Whitney said, because this agency should be doing X, Y, Z, and they just can't. They just don't have enough manpower. There's not enough tax dollars going their way. So maybe more effective effort is to lobby the legislature to get them money. This is a fact most people don't know, but tribes and agencies only have traditionally enough money to implement the Clean Water Act via what EPA gives them. Very few states, if any, add extra tax dollars to that. And if you think about what the Clean Water Act is responsible for, there's not enough money there from EPA for states to do that. So that tells me right there that citizens in every state in the union do not value their resource. They want somebody else to do it. So right there's some sweet spot to change that culture, is we all can do it. We all can do it better and together. So I don't know if that helps, but I put my email in the chat. And for anyone who wants more resources on that, there's more time than you guys have here. I'd be happy to provide more offline on that, on the relationship between those two.
Yep, looks like you got some new friends in the chat, Barb. So definitely looks like you'll be able to connect with them after we get off here today. Really appreciate your comments and thoughts here. And I feel like one thing you spoke to was sort of looking at different end uses for the data and not looking to one size fits all, standardize everything the same way, and realize that community level engagements are going to have a lot of different purposes, and not all of them are just going to be collecting research grade or regulatory grade data to inform, again, research or regulatory purposes. One huge component that we've seen, across the country and the world really entering into this is youth engagement and youth education, via watershed education and data collection and a lot of these activities that we've been talking about. But in those cases, you don't necessarily see the same need for rigor with the data, and it's a different kind of value being brought to the community. I know, Barb and Whitney, you both have experience working with youth around environmental education. I'm wondering if there's anything you'd like to speak to around that. Maybe Whitney first, since Barb has had some time to speak recently.
Sure. Yeah. So I love all the information that everyone has shared so far. Barb, you seem like you're just have a wealth of knowledge that you can share with everyone when it comes to tying together technical agencies or technology agencies and community work, which is really important. So speaking to, if I can just touch on Lynn's question about building relationships, utilize those advocacy organizations that are already doing that work, that are connected to local and state representatives. That's what they're there for. Even grassroots organizations. You have organizations that were started by people who were running larger agencies, and now they're on the ground working with community members. So utilize your grassroots agencies, organizations, your advocacy organizations. In Ohio, we have the Ohio Environmental Council, and we've just recently worked with them to put together a policy platform specifically for changing policy along the lines of environmental justice, and that took a lot of community stakeholders being involved in that process. So just throwing that out there, there are a ton of organizations that are doing the groundwork that you don't necessarily have to. You can just partner, piggyback on what it is that they're doing. So you don't have to be the one to do all that research that a lawyer may spend a ton of time doing or already knowing. So, because that can be intimidating to a lot of people, saying, well, if I have to do it, then I don't have the time for that. So there are people out here that are already doing it. So tap into those. And also your local government officials, council people, they want your vote. So that's the bottom line. If you express a concern to them, bring a few other residents together and express your concern to them, chances are they're going to listen, especially if you're giving them a really, really hard time about it. So at least in Cleveland, we have some council people, some government officials that are really, really hands-on with a lot of the issues that are happening right here in the city. So I did want to just throw that out there. Okay, next, repeat your question one more time. I was so focused on the relationship building aspect.
I think I was asking about, the impact that, watershed education and engaging youth in kind of open watersheds can have.
Absolutely. So what Organic Connects does, just a little bit of context, we work with youth, families, community members on creating that equitable access to the outdoors, to nature, to job opportunities in the green industry through an environmental justice lens. So that includes environmental education, that includes outdoor recreation. And with everyone on our team who serves a very specific role, you bring that team together and everyone is able to input on how we move forward. So when it comes to connecting with community members, when it comes to providing that information that helps people to understand, like you are part of the environmental movement. I think that what we are experiencing now is and have been for a long time, is the misunderstanding of what being a part of the environmental movement really means. You know, because unfortunately, the marketing material, the messaging through the media is that there is a specific demographic of people who are affluent and have the time to go camping. You know, you can afford that super expensive tent, or you have the money to go hiking through Europe. You know, so when you hear information like that, some people kind of think, well, that's not for me. You know, I don't have the time to do that. I don't have the money to travel. I'm afraid of even going into the woods, you know. So, but just the other day, you took a walk through the park. But I changed the way that was said. I reframed the way that, well, that's what Organic Connects does. I don't want to take all the credit for it. We reframe the way that information is shared, and that helps people to understand their connection to nature. And even talking about the cultural history, you know, you talk to a lot of individuals whose grandparents were throwing food scraps in the garden out back before it was called composting, you know, and it's just reframing the way that things are said is a really, really big way to reconnect people to nature, or help people understand their connection to nature a little bit better than the information that's out broadly. So I hope I'm touching on that, because I feel like I'm going on a tangent a little bit there, but correct me if I'm wrong, Max. Pull me back in if you need.
No, that's great, Whitney. Thank you so much. And we are actually getting towards the end of our time today, but I want to, you know, invite if any of our other panelists have, you know, last comments or thoughts they want to share. I definitely have a couple. Yeah, Brandon, you want to chime in?
Sure, really quick. I know we're running low on time, but yeah, part of it too, like there is a few things. One, like this idea of a lane, and like I think lawyers, agencies, and mayors, and a lot of just like the youth education, all having their own, I think, expertises to contribute is one thing, and us being just like more on the technical side of things, like having that kind of thing, but also figuring out how to connect all of those together in a way and creating those relationships. Circling back to that, I just wanted to add in from my own experiences, getting started on building those still gets my heart racing. I get really nervous when it comes to that, because, you know, it's not a community that I'm really a part of. So for me to reach out and, you know, try and meet someone new, it's like talking to a stranger, which I think can be like a good thing, like health wise. But yeah, like there is a sense of fear that it takes to get over. And for me, like I just tell myself, like I think there's something good here. And I think a lot of other people I've talked to, like I probably haven't spoken with them again. And I think that's okay, because there's a lot of other communities out there who do share like this vision that the environment is important, and that water plays a big role. And yeah, that's kind of at least what I use to like put myself up whenever I try and reach out to someone. So I just wanted to add that in.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that, Brandon. We're getting towards the last couple minutes here, but we do have a couple questions coming in the chat here that maybe Mark, you'd be able to speak to. The first is what type of open source platforms are available? And then the second one is what quality assurance is required for data collection to generate data acceptable for EPA? Maybe we can throw the first one to Mark and the second one to Barb just really quickly. Just a couple minutes if you've got quick thoughts on it.
But I think open source is maybe more Brandon's connection. I'm very familiar with open source. And I know, for example, USGS provides an open source library that you can use to go access USGS data, which does a really good job of presenting their data. So I'm not sure what other packages in open source would be most relevant to this kind of work. Maybe Brandon might have the best answer there.
Sure. I could at least maybe I'll pitch like what we worked on. It was called Open Storm, and it's still going on. It's part of the work that Professor Kirkus from the University of Michigan and I started up when I was there. The website is open-storm.org. And so that's, I mean, for me, the one that I'm most familiar with and very knowledgeable of. I'd be happy to share any more technical details about that. And I will add my email to the chat as well, because I think I have a lot of resources that I can just compile up and I'll send that list your way, whether it's like a data platform, a technological platform, any other sorts of tools. I'd be happy to share those with you.
Yeah, one open source, we make use of a lot of open source, but we don't believe that it's the solution for doing everything. And one bit of open source that's been great for scaling our database is Mongo database. So we're using the open source version of Mongo database, and it really gives us enormous potential performance. But there's a lot of underlying tools that I think are very beneficial that are available from open source.
Fantastic. I'm trying to think. We have time. I guess, Barb, yeah, do you want to speak really quickly to what type of quality assurance is considered acceptable at the federal level? Is that something that you feel comfortable speaking to?
So quality, yes, I can do that. So first of all, the EPA put out a nice guidance listening to the community on how to develop a quality assurance project plan, the items and outline a framework that has all, think of a framework that has all the questions that you should answer, no matter what your data use or purpose is. But that question you just asked, the context has to be, what is the quality of data for what purpose? Quality matches a purpose, a data use. And so there's different data uses out there, so there's different data quality. But they do have, and I'll try to send you that, Max, that link. They have a, and it doesn't matter if your purpose is education or compliance or advocacy or planning. The same data can be used for all those if it's high enough quality, but it also can be different. And so it's a different kind of data quality that they would accept. Typically, the EPA only accepts data quality plans from grants that they've administered or they are tied to. We are trying to get them to like approve QAPs to say, hey, that provides quality data for that purpose. Even if we're not going to use it, we would bless that plan, but they're not there yet. So again, I'll give that resource to Max. And if you want to talk to me offline, what your purpose is, I maybe could help you navigate that landscape.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Barb. And thank you all so much really for taking the time to have this discussion. I know we kind of covered a lot of different topics from the technical side to the social, organizational, and relationship building side. But I feel like these themes that we've touched on of, how can we use technology and community engagement to create, more positive environmental outcomes, social outcomes. How does this tie into, other issues of equity and economic justice and racial justice? These are really important issues for folks to be considering, particularly those of us in the technology world who are thinking about developing these solutions for communities. And one thing I took away is really just the importance of having real conversations about what is needed and what is possible with folks on the ground. So I just want to thank everyone again for participating today. Yeah, if folks have any interest in following up afterwards, feel free to reach out. You'll also get our recording from today. We do have another couple of water data forums coming up. Next month, our session will be focused on next generation asset health monitoring for smart utilities. So taking the conversation out of the watershed and back into the asset maps of utilities. And then in November, we'll actually be having a conversation that really touches onto this last question, which is a session focused on federal water data standards, the impact, value, and challenges of the different standards that are currently in place and being developed. So hope you all are able to join us for those future conversations. I just want to say thank you one last time to our panelists and to those of you who participated today. With that, it's Max Herzog from Cleveland Waterline signing off, and wish you all a great rest of your week. Bye now.